Hello, BookTube. This is the Rambling Raconteur, Jack, and I'm back. I just finished my first read of Loving by Henry Green. Um, it's an interesting book. Uh, Henry Green's definitely an acquired taste. Uh, his books are overwritten in aspects and underwritten in others, which sometimes strikes this delicate balance that you find almost nowhere else, and at other times can seem tedious or a bit turgid. But overall, the effect is very strong. It really is unlike most other mainstream general fiction works that are available. I had previously read another one of his novels, Party Going, an earlier novel, and so this is the second Henry Green book I've torn after. He was the son of an industrialist in early and mid 20th century England, and uh, was well educated and spent some time working in his family's industry, but also then began writing. And he employs some, from what I understand, he employs some different stylistic changes throughout his different novels, moving from the 1930s through, I believe, like the early 1950s. And this book is written in the 1940s and is set right at the beginning of World War II. It's set on an uh, English estate that's in Ireland about 20 years after Ireland has finally achieved some level of independence and home rule, which happened in the 1920s. And so this book is set at a family castle that's located in Ireland, but it's an English family that owns the castle, lives in the castle, maintains the castle, and has servants. And the real focus of the work is the servants who are operating within that setting, not really the wealthy family that's there. And that's uh, a particularly interesting piece. It's not like Evelyn Waugh's novels that are very much of that upper middle class or upper class, uh, you know, set of families. It's individuals, not so much families, but individuals who are very much working class, working in service, and the novel's just about how they're interacting with each other as changes are occurring. Obviously, with the war going on, there's starting to be rationing. Petrol or oil that they use for energy has been cut off, and so there's a lot of changes. One member of the family who owns the castle is in the British armed forces or navy, and so there's that sort of hovering around in the background. But what's really important are the interactions between the different adult characters who are in service for the family, and then to a certain extent the way the members of that family and a pair of very young children who belong to the wealthy family interact with those servants there on the grounds. The actual writing of the novel is quite interesting. It is primarily dialogue driven. It's not what we find in a lot of other works, especially some of those British novels from that time period and later on in the 20th century, and within that tradition, thinking like Dickens, Trollope, Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, even Jane Austen, all of those sort of British novelists. This book doesn't seem quite of a piece with them. It's not heavy on characterization. We're not taken into anyone's thoughts. We have no idea. We understand what people are saying, but we see what they're doing, but we very rarely have any glimpse into what they're actually thinking or what they're truly feeling. It all has to be inferred. It has to be deciphered from what they're saying and what they're doing. It is extremely well written, though. There will be pages of dialogue in ways that are reminiscent, honestly, of the. I couldn't think of very many other books that are like this. It reminded me a lot of the movies directed by Robert Altman, or to a certain extent by Howard Hawks, like His Girl Friday, where there are multiple characters speaking at the same time, and you have to really pay attention and listen closely to see who's saying what. There's three different conversations going on. If you're not actively listening and paying attention, you have no idea what's going on. But it also rewards rewatching those films. And this book was kind of that way. There are pages of dialogue where, if you're not paying attention, you have no idea who's involved in the conversation. What Green's trying to do is build up levels of irony. So there are two characters named Albert. One is he's 17 throughout part of the novel, and then he turns 18, which means he could now be serving in the British Army or the Air Force. And so there's this Albert who's a young footman, but there's also an Albert who's like a nephew of the cook, Mrs. Welch, and so there's two Alberts, and people have conversations about they're upset about one of the Alberts, but somebody else thinks they're referring to the other Albert, and there's all sorts of irony built in there that's very, very comical and very funny. But you have to be paying attention to the dialogue to catch on to that. It's a very subtle type of humor. I do want to read a very short passage where the family nurse is with the two young children, and they're watching some doves. The children are being told a story, but they're not listening to the story. They're watching these doves. Miss Swift began once more, and the doves, spiraling down in the funnel made by trees which were coming out all over in a yellow-green through chestnut sheaths the color of a horse's coat, settled one after another, each outside the door to his quarters, and after strutting once or twice, went on quarreling, murdering, and making love again. So then, not knowing any better, he let him have her hand, the nanny said. She's continuing this story that no one's listening to. Breathless, the children watched this leaning tower. Very soon one white dove was crouching with opened beak before another, with stuck-out chest. Not long after, they were at it once more, and the fat bird, grown thin now, had his head deep down the other's neck, which was swallowing in frantic gulps that shook its crescent body. Elsewhere, another bird trundled an egg to the edge. Yet another chased a fifth to a corner until it fluttered over behind, where these two began again. In pairs, they advanced and retreated. Then one more small mass fell without a thud. Pink. And so you can sort of get a glimpse of when Green's not just writing dialogue. He forms these incredible sentences that there is a deep sense throughout the book of color, of what color everything is. The different, grass, the rain, there's peacocks around the castle. And there's paintings within. They have to keep fires lit to keep, the paintings warm enough, because I have no idea, but they have to do this. Servants have to do this. They refer to rooms as the purple room or the red room. People are referred to as having different, shades within their skin of yellow and green and silver, and an older female character is referred to as having hair that is a silver that almost seems to be blue in certain lights. And so Green just invests so much of his description throughout the book with a great deal of color. And so you really are able to build up a sense of what this place looks like as you see these characters conversing and interacting. But again, you're never really taken into their minds. And it's a very interesting way to approach a narrative, and it's an interesting book to read. It's unlike most other books I'd read, and so because of that, it becomes challenging. It's very short, just over 200 pages, but it can be challenging because of how unlike other books it is. And so that's Loving by Henry Green. A couple of other books that kind of connect to it maybe in some ways. One set in almost the exact same period of time, actually during the early Irish Troubles, so not the 1970s, 1980s Irish Troubles, but the 1920s Irish Troubles, right after Ireland had been given some sort of home rule, but there were still some English people living there, and there were still English army officers and troops stationed there, is this book, The Last September by Elizabeth Bowen, and I believe this is her most well-known work. And it's set very much in that same time period. The writing style is vastly different, totally unlike Henry Green's, but the setting is very similar. Another book that came to mind were the different Jeeves and Wooster, specifically stories and novels by PG Wodehouse, which are hilarious. arguably one of the three or four funniest writers of all time, up there with Rabelais, Jane Austen. You know, just absolutely hysterical characterization, dialogue. You know, wonderful humor. And in part because of the sense Wodehouse has of the servants are kind of smarter than the masters and mistresses, and how clownish so much of the society is. And Henry Green doesn't take that laugh out loud approach. It's more of a snickering approach, but it's still very much there and of a piece. Another writer who if I understand correctly, in some ways really admitted Henry Green was an influence, and not someone whose novels I would recommend, but I would recommend the stories, would be John Updike. I think a lot of his sentence structure and his focus on, you know, trying to get a somewhat detailed setting in which characters interact is John Updike. Again, I wouldn't necessarily compare Henry Green's Loving to his novels, but I think his stories are that way. This book, Loving, while being a novel, in some ways read like an extended short story because of how there wasn't a huge amount of description into characters' thoughts. You know, you weren't immersed in a world, you were shown a world, not immersed in it. And I think of novels sometimes being more immersive experiences. And then finally, one other novel that kind of relates to it would be Henry Green's earlier novel, Party Going, which is set before World War II has started. I believe it's set in the very late 1930s, and involves an upper class group of characters who are going to be taking a train on vacation. And so stylistically very different, the setting's very different, but it shows the way Henry Green sort of changes pace in each of his works. And so again, that was Loving by Henry Green. I'm the Rambling Raconteur. Thank you, BookTube.